What we've got here is this chaotic scene. We've got a man shot, he dies. He got out a double-barrel shotgun, as most people had in those days, and he put one cartridge in it at least, and as Carroll advanced towards him, he shot him in the torso, and he bled heavily and he collapsed and so on. I'm Andrew Rule. This is Life and Crimes. There have been times when I've quoted some personal experience in our podcast. And one of them I recall is that fairly recently I was talking to my very aged mother who listens to this podcast, and she told me something interesting. She said, "You know Susan Armstrong that was murdered at Easy Street?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, what you don't know is that my mother, your grandmother, made the icing or iced the wedding cake for the Armstrong parents, for the parents of Susan Armstrong, because," she added, "we knew them quite well up at Strathbogie in the Euroa area where Strathbogie is, up on the Strathbogie tableland, not far from Euroa and not far from Benalla." And I filed that away, and I think we've mentioned that here and there. But recently she mentioned something else. She said, "Are you able to look up the case of Jack Carroll, who was shot in the Strathbogie Hotel just after the war?" She means after World War II. And I was able to look that up. And I looked it up in some old newspapers, and I found the details of this shooting, which was a pretty big deal in a very small, quiet, Sleepy Hollow place. Strathbogie was a tiny little farming hamlet, essentially, with, it had a pub and a general store and not much else in those days, just after World War II. And I said, "Why do you ask?" And my mother said, "Well, when I was a little girl living on the farm up near Strathbogie, my father sometimes employed people to do work on the farm, and one of them was this fellow called Jack Carroll, and he was, as far as I remember, a very pleasant young man, and he worked mending fences and doing that sort of farm work that happened in those days. Wombats used to tear holes in rabbit-proof fences, and you would need a lot of people patching those fences to keep them rabbit-proof, and that was a very big deal back then because rabbits were in plague proportions. In fact, most farms had teams of rabbiters trapping rabbits 7 days a week to keep up with the numbers. Anyway, turns out that this Jack Carroll left Australia during the war. I don't know that he served in the army, but my mother's impression is that he went to New Zealand and he worked there as a slaughterman, and he came back to his home district shortly after the war or at the end of the war, and he resumed doing a bit of work around the district. And I think that he possibly went back and did some work at my grandfather's farm, which was where my mother, by this stage, about 12 or 13 years old, might have seen him, and she would recognise him and he would know who she was. Anyway, she says that one day she caught the bus from Euroa back to Strathbogie, and she was supposed to be picked up by somebody to drop her home. And it was a very wet, dirty, cold day. And she got off the bus and there was a crowd of people and there was no real shelter. So she'd been told if the people giving her the ride weren't there to go into the hotel to get out of the weather. So she went into the hotel, which was not the usual thing probably for a 12 or 13-year-old girl to do. And she went in there, and Jack Carroll, this one we're talking about, who had worked on the farm, he was in there in the pub. I think he was staying there and he might have been working at the pub. And he said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And she said, "I'm waiting for a ride and I want to get out of the rain." And he said, "Well, this is no place for you. You shouldn't be in the lounge or whatever it was." He said, "You come in here." And he took her to a side room and he set the fire and lit the fire for her to keep her warm. And she thought what a nice, kind man he was. And it was. He was a nice, kind act by this sort of itinerant farm labourer, I guess, and slaughterman, whatever. It turns out that Jack Carroll, I think, was living at the hotel as people used to in those days. He was staying there in a sleep out or something with his wife, who was called Dorothy Carroll. And, country pubs in those days often had people living at them because that's what you did if you were a local worker and you didn't have your own house. You'd stay at the pub. And he probably, cut a bit of wood or did something to offset the rent or the board. But some months later, there's a great scandal in the district because it turns out that Jack Carroll has been shot, fatally wounded with a shotgun at the Strathbogie Hotel, the local pub. And this was shocking to locals because things like that usually don't happen in your little tiny one-horse town. And it stuck in my mother's memory because she'd known this fellow briefly out on the farm, and then she'd known him when she stepped into the pub and he lit the fire for her, and she thought he was quite a nice man. And so when he was shot, it stuck in her mind, and that's why she brought it up, 80-odd years later. She asked me about it, and I looked it up and I found the facts in old newspapers. And then I pick up a book. It's a sort of a pastiche of crime stories from the north central part of Victoria, from basically Mildura across to maybe Albury and down to, Euroa and across to Shepparton. And it's stitched together all these old-time crimes from the 1860s onwards. But one of the chapters is about the shooting of Jack Carroll at Strathbogie. And I've been going through it and having a bit of a look. And once you go through all the details, you can see sort of what happened that night. It appears that Jack Carroll had been in a truck accident the previous May. This shooting was in July of 1946. The previous May, a couple of months earlier, he'd been involved in a truck accident. This, of course, is the era when people didn't wear seatbelts. There were no seatbelts. They did not happen until the 70s, really. And a lot of people that were involved in even reasonably slow speed accidents, they went through windscreens or they hit their heads violently on the steering wheel or the door or the windscreen. And so a lot of people in those days got some sort of brain damage from traffic accidents. And it would appear that maybe Jack Carroll did. We can never be sure. But it seems that his behaviour in the intervening couple of months had deteriorated and that he'd shown signs of a very bad temper. The upshot of all this is that Jack Carroll behaved very badly, apparently, on the day that he was ultimately shot, or the day and the night. And he'd become very aggressive, it would seem, and I think he'd knocked around his own wife, Dorothy, and he'd frightened the publican's wife, Mrs. Joyce. The publican was called Thomas Joyce. And we've got Jack Carroll and Tom Joyce, which is interesting because it ends up Carroll versus Joyce, which sounds like two women, but it's not. People around him are getting increasingly frightened because he's behaving so belligerently. I think he'd put hands on his own wife. He'd left red marks on her neck, according to a doctor who subsequently looked at her. Two blokes, a local, a shearer and another guy who were in the pub, they'd tried to intervene, and it looks as if Jack Carroll had punched both of them pretty severely. There were some reports of him knocking them out. I don't know if that'd be right, but anyway, he clearly was a pretty tough bloke. He'd worked in slaughterhouses, and a lot of slaughtermen are pretty tough. So he'd punched those two guys, and he was continuing to frighten his own wife and the publican's wife. And the publican had no chance of getting the police there quickly because they would have to come from Euroa by, a slow car on a slow road. And although they'd probably made the phone call, it was going to take them a while to get there. And meanwhile, at the Strathbogie pub, things are getting very heated and everybody is very scared of Jack Carroll, who's gone right off his trolley. And ultimately, Tom Joyce, the publican, who was a few years older than Carroll, not much, he got out a double-barrel shotgun, as most people had in those days, and he put one cartridge in it at least, and as Carroll advanced towards him, he shot him in the torso, and he bled heavily and he collapsed and so on. Police got there then, I don't know if there was an ambulance, but they bandaged him up as best they could, but he was bleeding heavily, and then took him over to Marupna Hospital, which is near Shepparton, across country, and he died there. So the shooting then becomes potentially a homicide, a murder or a manslaughter. And Thomas Joyce, the publican, was in fact, I think, charged with murder. And he was bailed. There was no doubt that there was some sympathy for him by magistrates and the police. He was bailed for £500, which was a lot of money in 1946, probably the price of a cheap house in those days. He raised the bail money and he was released pending trial. Very different from now. Nowadays you'd probably wait 18 months before you went to court, but in those days, within a matter of weeks, between July and September. So on the 4th of September, 1946, just weeks after the shooting, the man who pulled the trigger, Tom Joyce, appears before a jury in Melbourne, before Justice Bell. And there the police presented several exhibits, including the double-barrelled shotgun, some live and spent cartridges, a blood-stained nightdress. I imagine that might have belonged to Mrs. Carroll, I'm not sure, but anyway, it was blood-stained pyjamas, let's say, blood-stained trousers and a shirt, as well as X-ray images. A Dr. Waterhouse from Euroa reported that he had attended to Carroll following the shooting. He noted that Carroll did not have any detectable smell of alcohol on his breath. This is not a terribly scientific procedure in those days. Dr. Waterhouse observed Carroll's wife, Dorothy, who had visible red marks on her neck, and he found Mrs. Joyce, the publican's wife, Henrietta Joyce, in a state of distress while lying in bed. Both women had appeared to be upset, so this Dr. Waterhouse has obviously given evidence of what he found on the night. Very upset and scared women, and the doctor went on to say that he had treated Jack Carroll after a truck crash 2 months prior to the incident, and he'd also provided care for his anxiety disorder, his nervous disposition, before that accident. So clearly Jack Carroll had been under some sort of mental strain. And he admitted that there was a possibility that the road crash, the truck crash, had affected Carroll's mental state. Dr. Schloffel, a resident doctor at Marupna, stated that he performed the autopsy on Carroll's body and concluded that he died as a result of bleeding and trauma. Well, he would have. A copious quantity of pellets was present in the injury, and they said that 3 masses of fabric were found in lung tissue. So the shotgun pellets had blasted the clothes he was wearing clear through his rib cage into his lungs. A shotgun will do that. They're fearsome things. Dorothy Carroll, the one who was married to the dead man, continued to provide her testimony. She stated that after an incident at the hotel on July the 13th, the day of the shooting, she encountered Mr. Joyce, Tom Joyce, the publican, in a hallway. And that's when Joyce admitted that he had fired at her husband, Jack. And he said words to this effect. Now, these are the sort of legal words. They probably weren't exactly as they were spoken. I was compelled to undertake the task. There were no other options available to me except for doing this, which will be sort of police speak for what he actually would have said was, I had to do it. Something like that. Dorothy said that she'd noticed the smell of alcohol on her husband's breath, although she hadn't seen him drinking beforehand. She also explained that he had suffered an injury in the truck crash in May, and after that crash had had frequent arguments with her, which is interesting. A shearer from Merton, which is another little district not far away, his name was Philip Thomas Fraser. He stated that he'd been acquainted with Jack Carroll for 7 years. He said that on the day of the shooting, he was present at the Strathbogie Hotel where Jack Carroll appeared to have had a few drinks. Fraser later noticed, he said, sounds of excitement, meaning probably some sort of clamour or alarm coming from the sleep-out area where the Carroll family was staying. So Carroll and his wife and possibly children were staying in this sleep-out. It would appear that the publican Tom Joyce was called over because of all this carry-on, and he'd tapped gently on the door of the sleep-out, and he said, "What's wrong?" And Mrs. Carroll had said, "He's hurting me." And the publican said, "Sing out if you want help." And Mrs. Carroll said, "I want help now." Carroll came through the sleep-out door, saw Fraser standing there, grabbed hold of him and threw 4 to 6 punches at him. Later, Carroll shook his hand and said, "You've been a good friend to me, Phil." So clearly Jack Carroll was up and down. Later, Fraser heard 2 more screams from the sleep-out before a man named McCrell ran out. He noticed another man lying face down at the sleep-out door, while several other men were wrestling on the veranda. With the help of a man named Wade, he picked up Alf Ford, who had been knocked out. The 2 men he had seen struggling were Wade and Carroll. So the net meaning of all this is that Jack Carroll has gone off his head and the people have tried to stop him, they've tried to hold him down, but he's right off and he's throwing punches everywhere and frightening hell out of everyone present because he's quite irrational. It was 5 minutes after that scene that the gunshot was heard. Fraser, the shearer, was walking down the passage to Mrs. Joyce's room and found Carroll lying in front of the door, wounded in the left shoulder. Later, one of the other witnesses, a station hand called Alf Ford, whose name we mentioned, described being at the pub shortly after lunch earlier that day, and he'd seen Carroll have 7 or 8 drinks. And Alf Ford also recalled the publican saying, "I want you to hang on for a while. Johnny's gone a bit funny again, and I've rung for the police." So what we've got here is this chaotic scene. We've got a man shot, he dies. We've got the publican charged with murder initially. He goes to court in Melbourne subsequently in September, and those charges are changed to manslaughter, and all the evidence, which we've given a rough version of here, is produced for the jury to listen to and the judge. And eventually the jury found Thomas Joyce not guilty of manslaughter because of the circumstances. It seemed clear to the jury that Jack Carroll had gone, if not crazy, at least very aggressive, and that he'd been shot in essentially self-defence and in defence of his own wife, Mrs. Carroll, and in defence of Joyce the publican and his wife, if not many other people that were at the hotel that day. The court proceedings were not completed until 1 year later, in July 1947, when the trial was held at the Melbourne General Sessions Court. And over the course of 4 days, evidence similar to that presented during the inquest and the committal was presented. After only 2 hours, the jury decided to acquit Thomas Joyce, and that was the end of that. But all these years later, 8 decades later, my mother, who's 94 years old, can't help wondering why the nice man that she'd known mending fences on the farm, the nice man who'd said, "You shouldn't be in this pub, in this, bar or whatever it was," and took her in and lit a fire for her to keep her warm, she still wonders what happened, why he turned so crazy and why he was shot. For all these years, 80-odd years, my mother had imagined that Jack Carroll, a nice, kind man as far as she knew, had been wrongly shot dead. But it would appear otherwise. He'd gone crazy, he'd hurt people, and this is what happened. At a wild guess, you'd have to think that Jack Carroll probably suffered some form of brain damage from the truck accident that he was involved in. And that is what started this homicidal turn of events. He wouldn't be the first person to turn violent as a result of brain injury. If, as we suspect, Jack Carroll went rogue because of a head injury, I think that is likely, it wouldn't be the first time. I'm struck at how often it turns out that people who do very bad things have suffered brain injuries at some point. It is a recurring theme, and it's one that I'd like to look at some other time. Perhaps we might even get an expert to talk about it. And now a little bit of housekeeping. Life and Crimes is now available not only for audio, but as video. And it's available on the Herald Sun's very own YouTube channel. Go and have a look. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.